This is a Boring Climate Podcast, a platform where we encourage serious climate conversations. When we talk about climate change, it's often in the context of faraway oceans or forests, or species of animals and birds that we may never see. But in a rapidly urbanizing India, cities with their dense populations and heterogeneous environments are increasingly becoming spaces of conflict between people and nature. Today, we're focusing on how close nature is to the city, and therefore the climate change impacts we must mitigate and guard against. Joining us today is Dr. Harini Nagendra, an urban ecologist and director at the School of Climate Change and Sustainability at Azim Premji University in Bangalore. She uses remote sensing, field studies, and community interviews to understand sustainability in cities in the global south. She is also an IPCC author. Her interdisciplinary research has been award-winning and looks at the importance of urban ecosystems in building urban resilience. We're thrilled to have you on the show, Harini.
It's a pleasure to be here, Vishwada.
So we'll start with the basics. What is urban ecology and what is the scope of your area of study?
Sure. It's very broad, actually. So urban ecology is very simple. It's the ecology of life in cities. But it's not that simple if you think of the fact that, so if you think of ecology really looks at ecosystems which are habitats, so homes for animals, right? So it's very animals, plants, biodiversity, could be a microorganism, could be anything. But it's very much focused on the natural sciences typically. How do animals live their lives in whatever settings they are? Let's say a polar bear in the ice, in an ice-rich area, or an ant which is in an ant hill, if you want to get really micro. But if you're looking at a city, any life in a city has to include human beings as the very dominant player that is reshaping the ecology and place and habitat and everything else. So urban ecology is a little different from ecology at large in the sense that the human aspect of it becomes much stronger, and then it becomes a very interdisciplinary subject. So you're looking at how species live, what are the species in the city, how do they live, how have they been changing over time, what do aspects like pollution, etc., play a role, how is climate changing the city. But you're also looking very importantly at the connection between people and nature. How do people influence the nature in cities? And how does nature in turn affect the way people think, believe, relate to nature? So for instance, let's say I plant a certain kind of tree species. Right? That tree species changes maybe how much time I spent outdoors. The time I spent outdoors reflects my appreciation for trees, and maybe I plant more trees. So sometimes it's a positive loop, sometimes it's a negative kind of an interaction. So urban ecology, short form, basically it's everything to do with people-nature relationships in cities.
Right. Which brings me to my next question. So in some of your books, which you've written to take this science to the people, you've spoken about how Bangalore's environment has degraded over the years, but you've also spoken about the tenacity of nature.
Right.
And so to paint a picture of what exactly urban ecology is, could you tell us how we interact with nature, say in our parks or streets or home gardens?
Right. So I think the first thing is that nature in the city is everywhere. So it could be a potted plant on your terrace. It could be, I was recently reading about Nirav Modi's uncle, I forget his name, the guy who's been arrested and brought.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. So apparently his apartment in Bombay is being taken over by trees. So it could be that people tree growing in the cracks on your apartment wall. It could be a park, it could be a lake. So it's everything, a wooded street, right? But we interact with it in so many ways in the city, depending on who we are. So someone who has mental stresses, and who doesn't have mental stresses living in a city, can find stress relief just interacting with that potted plant, seeing a butterfly, or in times of COVID, I know I used to walk on my rooftop and watch the kite call out, and I didn't feel as trapped at home, right? So there's all that. People also in the city, especially in Indian cities, are grazers and fishers and foragers and wood collectors, and we don't think of them as living in a modern city, right? We might see people like us who are apartment dwellers. We see people walking and jogging and taking their children. And that's urban uses of a park and a lake.
Right.
But you'll also see the fishers, you'll also see grazers, you'll also see people who are collecting the dry sticks and, migrant workers. You'll also see women who are foraging for weeds and who cook with those weeds. And they're also using nature in the city in multiple forms. And there are many other people. For instance, we found transgender people using parks in lakes in Bangalore, because they said, when I sit in front of the lake doesn't judge me. Right? We found the mother of a child with ADHD saying she brings him every day to the lake in the morning because he can act out his energies in front of the lake and calm down, and it's a nice safe space for him. He feels happy in front of the lake, and she says he has a good day and I have a good day. Simple, beautiful things. So I think between that, it can tell you that we relate to nature in the city, or it's important to us in so many different ways.
Right. And how do you study nature in the city? What are the tools or data
That
sets
gets
you-
really, really complicated. I mean, it's diverse. So we use satellite remote sensing to see how the areas have changed over time.
Right.
We use geographical information systems, GPS maps, and old historical maps of the city to see how lakes and parks and wells have changed.
Right.
For instance, we've looked at the number of lakes we've lost in the past 150 years, which is massive in Bangalore.
Right.
We've looked at open wells, which went from 1,500 to about 30 open wells. And those are the numbers you can get only from GIS and mapping, right? But then you have to look at why changes are happening. So we look at a lot of archival records, and archival records, especially in the British archives, will tell you about some law that was passed, some policy that was effected, and that's the reason why this lake disappeared. For instance, Sampangi Lake was lost because the British wanted to play polo, and the lake was flooding their breweries, right? So you get that. But you only get the British or the dominant Indian bureaucrats' perspective. Then we get to oral histories. So we actually go to people, an old fisher, an old grazer, an elderly person resident in someone in the 80s, 90s, and ask them about what their grandparents told us. With that, you can get 120, 150 years back in time. Or you might get some autobiographies or biographies if you're lucky, right? Letters that someone has written. So there's that. That we do a lot of interviews with people, semi-sociological, anthropological. How do you use nature in your daily life?
Right.
Lot of observation. Just stand at a lake, see who's using what for what. And then biodiversity work. Lot of looking at, for instance, we might look at eBird to look at what kinds of birds use the city and how has that changed over time. When you restore a lake, how do bird species come back? We might ourselves go and do bird counts and butterfly counts and tree counts. So it's a range of different things, methods all over the place. When we teach our students, we do a qualitative and a quantitative methods. Goes in the number of methods we could pack in is actually infinite.
Yeah. Very interesting, which also brings me to a recent study of yours, which along the Bangalore-Mysore region, where you use Google Earth.
Right.
Right. Can you tell me what were the insights from that study of how this region has changed and how that could maybe better inform how we develop these
Exactly.
regions? Yeah.
So one of the things that that has happened to India's urbanization is that cities are growing instead of consolidating or coalescing into one another. So Mysore is a separate city, Bangalore is a separate city, but slowly if you actually look along the highway, you have so many, Chennapatna, Ramnagara, all of these sit Mandya. By the time they all join up, it's actually one long urbanizing corridor. So one of the things we were trying to figure out with this study was actually, can we create, there's so many journalists or policymakers or citizen groups or activist groups or, even judges who want to know what's going on in their area, who want to know how these areas are changing. And right now, only academics have the information, or maybe a policymaker has the information.
Right.
So we're trying to use Google Earth Engine, which is an open source thing, to see how these areas are urbanizing between Bangalore and Mysore. And what we found is that there's been a huge amount of urbanization over time. Water bodies have been very hard hit. Green areas have been very hard hit, and agriculture areas are also disappearing very fast. So it's broadly it, and also the idea is, if you don't plan near the highway better, you're going to have an entire stretch which is just a concrete jungle, and then people live in those areas, so that's going to be really impacting them.
Right. And closer to Bangalore, you also studied two landmarks in Bangalore, the Pelandur Lake and Lalbagh.
Yeah.
And you showed how water or green spaces affect the microclimate of that region.
Yes.
What was some of the successes and failures that Bangalore has achieved in preserving them? And what are some lessons that other cities struggling with these changes could take?
See, one of the things that Bangalore has always been very well known for is its green spaces, its lakes, its parks. It was called the Garden City of India, the Kalyana Nagara, which is the lakes Lake City of India. And now, of course, many of them have gone. But if you look at the central part of Bangalore, we're still very good in terms of green spaces. We're fortunate to have two large botanical gardens, both Cubbon Park and Lal Bagh. We have the Banarkanta Biological Park and the National Park also. That's very large, again, national forest and reserve forest patches, very close to the city. They give us some amount of buffer in terms of microclimate. The lake system is also relatively, it's lost within the heart of the city. We've lost the Miller's Tank, the Sampige, the Keren, and all of those areas that we had originally. But in the periphery of the city, they are still very well intact, like Belandur Lake. Belandur Lake used to be Bangalore's largest lake system. It is still very large. but not as large as it used to be. So we were very curious to know, it's a hard sell to tell your local person on the street or your policymaker that keep your lake and park because it's good for biodiversity, it's good for nature in the city. Because they're really looking at it as real estate values and, getting more traffic on the road and roads and park, expansion of roads and infrastructure. So we said, heat? We all know that urban heat islands are really impacting us. And I mean, Bangalore's in the middle of a hot summer right now. We know the impacts on health.
Yeah.
If you look at pollution and health, these two very important things that people care about, pollution and heat. And let's map that. So we looked at the impact of both Lalbagh and Belandur on heat. Just looking at, again, satellite images which give you a sense of surface heat. And you can see that the park cools the city substantially. You can really there's a physical difference. I mean, if you walk into Lalbagh or walk around Belandur Lake, you will feel the difference. But we don't give it enough importance. And to have something of that size, it's very different from having a small pocket park. So we're also looking at how much it cools the neighborhood around it, right? And there's a substantial cooling effect, not just in the park, but at the edge of the park, which gets out into the city at large. So that's really what we were trying to do with that study.
Right. So Belandur, Lalbagh, these are center of the cities. In and around, there are people who are mostly affluent living. Yeah. But we move into the so-called in-between spaces, the peri-urban areas, where mostly the people migrating into the cities are living. What are the impacts of climate change there, and are there ways for them to mitigate it?
Right. The peri-urban, especially in Bangalore, is an area that it's a hard area to live in.
Right.
And as you say, I mean, we are in Sarjapur now, which is a very good example of this. On Sarjapur Road, we used to have hundreds of these really old, centuries old trees. We know that they're at least a century old. We don't know how much older than that. All mercilessly chopped in the past 5 to 6 years because of road widening. I mean, we lost probably, 500 trees, 1,000 trees, all more than a century old. So think of the impacts of that. We're also having massive amounts of building, which means all of your, suspended particulate matter, especially PM 2.5, the really fine particulate matter that goes into your lungs and blocks it. So there's that. Then you have the urban heat. Because of all this concrete, you have crazy amounts of heat. And you've cut down all the trees. So, and because you've lost the lakes and the waterways that connected them, you have a very strange problem that is we are in a semi-arid area, but we used to be a water positive region because of all our lakes. So which means we had groundwater that levels were fairly high. But now you have flooding in the monsoon because there's no lake system to absorb it. And the same areas that were flooded are bone dry in the summer, and your bore well, which is really deep, goes dry, right? So we have all of these complex challenges, and who's suffering the most? Because the peri-urban, like you pointed out, it's this odd mix. You have these high-rise apartments where they're multi-crore apartments. Right next to them, you'll have people that are living in extreme poverty, maybe even malnutrition because of hunger. And you have that level of, people dying or really falling sick because of hunger. And that's a really crazy disparity, which you might not see that to that extent in Bangalore. So people who suffer because of heat, because of pollution, because of flooding, because of drought, those are going to be the poor. They're the ones who pay massive amounts for, let's say, a pot of water, whereas I could buy a tanker at a steep discount. They're going to pay for a pot of water, right? Or they're going to be the ones affected by dengue because of mosquitoes and land up in the hospital because they're malnutrition. So, yeah, they're the ones who are facing really the brunt of climate change induced heating and flooding and all of these things.
Yeah. So the impact of green infrastructure or nature-based solutions, such as an afforestation project, for instance, the benefits of these are well documented and studied for rural populations. So forests being provider of fodder, livelihoods, etc. But in a peri-urban area like this, that could also be useful.
Absolutely.
Do you think green infrastructure planning in cities and peri-urban areas are being, co-created, or are they being, done in silos?
They're not being co-created. They're not. I wish even if they were done in silos, but they're not even being done in silos.
Okay.
So the challenge again about the peri-urban is it's also the place where it's sort of a no man's land. In your village areas, you have zoning laws. In your city, you have zoning laws. What happens in the peri-urban is the speed of capital influx and infrastructure expansion is such that all the laws are sort of they're on paper and they don't get followed. And there is no city administration to enforce this. So it's a no man's land. All your commons, all your ecological spaces get built over, right? And so what happens is you don't have all the natural infrastructure that was there is destroyed, and there is no city planning to put it back. And I'll give you an example. So Hita Unikrishnan, my colleague, and I, we did this analysis of climate heat action plans and climate action plans across the country. And we found that nature-based solutions were in very few of them. resilience is always mentioned. Resilience is never defined. It's a nice term to have because it makes your report planning report look good. But what you have is finally SMS alerts to say stay in buildings in the heat. How do you reduce the heat to begin with? You would do that through trees, through lakes, through these nature-based solutions and cooling solutions.
Correct.
They are not set up. And when they are set up, there is absolutely no mention of community-based involvement. That's not there at all.
Right.
And you can see this in Bangalore. Nobody consults the local community when you cut down trees. There are PILs and they say you're supposed to consult the community, but they're almost never consulted.
Right.
So this is a real problem for us. I mean, we're only cutting down the trees and filling in our lakes and talking about nature-based solutions.
Yeah. So which was actually my next question. It's not really being developed as a public good.
No, absolutely not. When it is, it's very cosmetically. I remember again, just before COVID, there was this whole craze in metro stations to say, okay, metros have cut down trees, we'll make these metros carbon sinks or pollution sinks. And they were tying pots to their pillars. And the plants died in 2 months. And it's kind of obvious in retrospect that the plants would die. So this is the challenge that we have. Lot of lip service, and you're right that they're private, because if you look at all the high-end gated communities and apartment complexes, they're all touting their green infrastructure inside. It's like Singapore inside, or it would be nice if it was like Bangalore inside and outside. Again, if you take Bangalore as an example, or Delhi or Pune or any of these old cities, you'll see that the inside is greener than the periphery. And that's because the inside was at a time when the city was planned and had these old parks. In Delhi, for instance, the Deer Park or Lodi Gardens, in Bangalore, Lal Bagh, Kaban Park. You don't have such parks in the periphery. And we could actually have them. We have the land for them.
Right. So to understand climate change, to understand ecology in urban spaces, there is a degree of climate data required. But climate data is not very freely accessible or available. So let's come to climate data democracy.
Yeah.
How would you define that for especially cities in the global south?
This is an important point because it's something, as you know, we've been working on. So we were looking at climate data, and there's a lot of complexity about climate data. For instance, there are a number of different models out there. People don't understand which model to use. They don't know how to access and download the data. It's not spatial. It's something like, unless you know Python coding, for instance, or you don't know how to download this and to test it, right? You need to understand how to put it into a GIS system and look at it spatially. A lot of the climate data forecasts are for, let's say, the state of Karnataka, which makes no sense when you have the coasts of Bangalore, the plateau of Bangalore, and the mining area of Bellary. You need something far more fine-scaled. And they'll also give you projections for 2017, 2100, which no policymaker, actually no citizen also really cares about, because they think by then something will happen. Actually, things will get worse. But nobody really cares about a projection that far ahead. So one of the things we were thinking of is how do you get a climate data set that is downscaled and more near future, what's going to happen to us now, which we created out of existing models, putting them together, an ensemble of models. The next thing we were looking at is how do you actually explain this to people? And that's when we started getting at the idea of climate data democracy. We run a course for experienced journalists across India and on understanding climate data and really how to work with data-based journalism for climate change. And what we found is most of them don't know where the authoritative data sets are, what is the credibility, how do you deal with probability issues, whom do you ask to verify certain things. And we realized academia should be doing this because in some sense, I'm not saying we're unbiased, but we're relatively far less biased. Plus, we're trained as educators, right, to how to communicate and things like that. So we came up with the idea of climate data democracy, saying data is very important. Everybody needs to know how to use their data. You might be a community organizer. You might be a school student interested in knowing about your future and telling your classmates. You could be a teacher. You could be an activist. You could be a government public. In fact, our biggest target for climate data democracy is actually teachers and public officials,
Right.
because we feel they need the data. But for all this, you need data democracy, as in data should be open and available and translated to someone to understand, to help them understand how to use it.
Right.
And that's something we've been working on at the university.
Is this what the Bangalore Canvas tool is, or is that?
That's part of our our data democracy suite. So with the Bangalore Canvas, our idea was to take Bangalore as a test case. We have a lot of, like I said, Google Earth images, Landsat images, Government of India, Indian Remote Sensing Satellite images. We have Google Earth Engine, which helps you digest all that information. We have some satellites that give you heat information. We have satellites that give you pollution-based information. And you can look at roads, through OpenStreetMaps. You have information on roads, on lakes, on parks, and all of those things. How do you put all of this together again, like I said, if you're looking at urbanization in Bangalore and Mysore and interested in the future, what can you understand? If you're a journalist who, let's say, wants to write about the importance of Kabban Park and Lal Bagh, how do you know how it's useful for heat protection in the city?
Right.
So we put all the data sets together and created this Bengaluru canvas, as we called it, which is basically a little app that you can go onto and click, and it gives you graphs and things like that. You can play with it. You can change the time period. You can change the geographic focus. You can add data sets. You can subtract it.
Okay.
And our idea is using not Bengaluru just only for Bengaluru's sake, which is also important, but as a demonstration that you can create a Pune campus, a Delhi canvas, and all of these places.
In terms of democratizing climate data, is there space for, say, citizen science or participatory models in cities of the global south to make sure that this data is more freely available and more easily understood?
Absolutely. See, and that's really been our focus. I mean, I should actually say that this is a Bengaluru canvas, for instance, my colleague Shantanu Goswami has been working with a number of young RAs to do it. So what you see there in the canvas is a lot of work by younger people who are engineering graduates or students, sometimes working students who came in, who were interns, and they've all contributed their energies to get this done. So which is very nice for us because it's young people putting it together. It's not sort of us driving the whole thing, right? So just like that in the Bangalore canvas, a lot of our research has been done with young people, sometimes our own students, sometimes interns in various other places. We worked with St. Joseph's College, we worked with Mount Carmel's College, for instance, and they have contributed. So it's one version of citizen science. But there are many other things that you can get from citizen science. So one thing we did, which was a study of looking at bird species around lakes that I was talking about, used eBird data. eBird data is, of course, contributed by naturalists across the country. And we did something very simple. Bangalore is known for its lake restoration driven by communities. Has that lake restoration contributed to the recovery of bird species? So we found that it has, but of some species and not others. And what you find is the ground nesting species, certain kinds of ducks, for instance, they've actually disappeared over time.
Okay.
Migratory species continue to be impacted because there's several things along the migratory route that we can't fix just by having a restored lake. But the resident species, especially the ones that are not nesting at the base, on the ground and in the water, are actually recovering. And our hypothesis, it's just a hypothesis right now, is that cats and dogs, feral cats and feral dogs are coming into the lake and stealing the eggs. And therefore, because they're ground nesting, they're vulnerable. Because why is one set of species? Why is it that ducks are especially affected, for instance? So these kinds of citizen science is just an example to tell you that if we didn't have the citizen science database, how would we get at these insights? We can't go back 20 years in the past and say what happened to these lakes. Nor can we have data of that rich quality that regular people, year after year, week after week, day after day are going in and sampling these lakes. So citizen science is hugely important for a lot of things.
Right. Which brings me to the next segment so urban centers drive economic growth, but they're also exacerbating the environmental degradation.
Absolutely.
So there has to be some amount of policy intervention to make sure that it's balanced. How would all of this science and research get translated into a language or form that policymakers can use and actually implement in how they develop cities or corridors?
So our idea with Bengaluru Canvas, for instance, or the other kinds of work that we're doing with the climate data sets, is that policymakers should be able to use this to plan in advance. What's often happening is we have a very reactive approach of planning.
Right.
A flood happens. After the flood, we're saying, okay, we're going to plan for the next flood by doing certain things, but by the time the next heat wave has arisen. So we're tackling the heat wave. By the time we're tackling the heat wave, the monsoon is there and the flooding is started. We're absolutely not thinking of the future. So we need to start thinking of what to expect in the future and plan for that. And that's something, for instance, I'll give you another example. If you look at, apart from the lakes, we have drains which were originally our colorways or water channels that actually absorb the water.
Right.
Now those drains or the water channels, stormwater channels, they are built for the average rainfall, or maybe slightly more than average rainfall. But if you have under climate change, a world where extremes are the new normal, and you get 3 times, 10 times the amount of rain, and that's going to become increasingly normal, your drain size has to be much larger. And so you have to plan for that future. So this is where I think academia can play a role in working with policymakers and showing them that these are the projections to expect, and this is how you can plan. Plan your informal settlements, plan your wealthy neighborhoods, your lakes, parks, etc. to manage all of this. The challenge now becomes how to reach the policymakers, because in some places we've been very successful, in some places not at all successful.
Right. Could you give me an example from, say, one of your studies or research on maybe how vegetation versus built-up area, how understanding what this is and why one causes less heat and one causes more heat, how that could be translated into real world.
Into real life. I can give you a couple of examples actually. So one, I'll give you something that actually happened, and it's on lakes. When I was originally working with lake restoration, and we were working with the municipality on restoration of one lake, the Kaikondrili Lake.
Right.
And at that point, what the BBMP, the municipality was doing was a very piecemeal approach of restoring lakes. So they would restore one lake in this part of the city, another lake in another part of the city, and then a third lake somewhere else. But lakes are hydrologically interconnected, and the water flows from one lake to another in these subsystems. So what we were trying to tell them was, if you don't restore the lake that is upstream and downstream along with this particular lake, you're going to have a problem, because 5 years from now, your entire restoration will collapse. So after a long time, we were actually able to convince the BBMP, and this is, when I say we, it is me and the academic institution, as well as the community members in that system, who are also equally responsible for reaching the government. And you can't do this alone, just as an academic institution. You need the support of the ground up kind of the community support. And what then the government did was they restored an entire sub-chain of 7 lakes. And that restoration is still holding strong today, where many other restorations have failed, because they actually started to see these as hydrological interconnected sets. So you have to actually change that entire subsystem together. Right? So that's one example. Another thing is, we had worked with Wipro to create a butterfly park for them. And originally they were interested in becoming a carbon positive areas to become a carbon sink. So we said, let's look at your water management instead, and look at your biodiversity management, and see if you plant trees strategically, how can you reduce heat? And that's been very successful, because you see there's a massive migration of butterflies every year to that particular campus in one of the Wipro campuses. Water management is excellent in that campus. You see trees giving you a lot of shade and employees coming out. And that's, those are the kinds of positive examples you would hope that others can learn from.
Right, which is my next question. So we've spoken about the policy making part of it, but how can private investment do more to create these urban ecosystems?
Which is a very important point. See, one of the things I think is that it's very important for any company, for instance, to see how can they implement nature-based solutions on their own campus for their own employee benefit, as well as reducing costs. And that's where I really don't understand why we design our campuses in such a way, even educational institutions. So many architecture universities that I see which are concrete everywhere. It's hot. You spend a lot of money on fans and air conditioning. Everyone's uncomfortable. It's not resilient in any way. The place floods. It does, you pay a huge amount of money for water. So if you had, for instance, micro wells, so you did a lot of groundwater recharge. If you had a lake or some other system by which you could store the water above ground, the excess water that came in through rains. You had trees planted strategically so that you could have outdoor meetings. The brain also gets much more creative during outdoor meetings. We've talked right now about a lot of the physical benefits, but we've not talked about the mental benefits. And that's huge in a city, because you need creativity in any corporate setup, in any company, whatever kind of company it is. And you have that. You have mental stress relief. You have employees feeling a strong sense of place and ownership. Again, in the Wipro Butterfly Park, we've seen this, that employees engage so much because it becomes like an informal competition. Who's seen how many butterflies?
Right.
You feel a sense of satisfaction coming into work. You feel an ownership of the place. And that can't be bought for any money, right? So I think there's a lot there that a little bit of investment can pay off in huge amounts. And I find it interesting that everyone wants to do a solar energy, but nobody's, and a sewage treatment plant, of course, which they're required to legal by law. But no one is understanding the importance of planting trees. Or, for instance, something very simple we've been recommending to all private institutions is, in a city, space is so scarce. So plant a tree that gives you shade, that you can climb and sit, because there are and fruiting. Or something that gives you food. Because when you can actually have employees harvesting something,
Right.
that's when you interface with. Or have a weed garden, but these are weeds that you can forage with and cook with. You learn a little bit more about biodiversity, you go back and home and use it in your garden. So many things that could be done. And I feel like we need many more demonstration places that a company would invest in, and then take as demonstration places to its neighborhood.
Right.
And that is really what you need. A lot of it.
Coming to what remains to be studied, or gaps in climate science, specifically in the urban context, what are these gaps and what more could we be studying?
I'd say, frankly, everything is a gap, and what we know are sort of a few bright spots, few street lights in a dark place. But I'm very serious. For instance, you want to know how many trees there were in the past and how many there are now. We have no data. You want to know what trees grow well in an urban context? No data. What trees are better for combating air pollution? No data. What trees are better for reducing heat? No data. How large should a lake be, for instance, to have groundwater recharge? What kind of what should the edges be like, the boundary? Should it be mud? Should it be stone? Should it be pitched in what way? Very little. So almost everything is unknown. And that also means for anyone who comes in and wants to do everything, when you start an intervention, one of the things we have never done, and as a country, we tend to be a very anecdotal based, evidence based country, right? So people do a lot of interventions and they have a lot of intuitive knowledge, but no one has ever tested that knowledge, which means I don't know how to take your intervention in Pune to my application in Bengaluru, and that's really a problem. So there's a lot to be done, and I think that just means that everybody has a role to step in and do these things, because some of these things are very simple to track, right?
Right.
That's something that we really need a lot more to be done.
Right. And any advice for future climate researchers?
Absolutely. I think the thing that we've been doing in India, we have some excellent climate research, but a lot of it is very natural science focused. And what we really need to impact society is interdisciplinary research where science and society is engaged. So I'll give you an example. Again, if you have climate data sets, one of the things would be to explain the data sets to people, but also see how people engage with ideas of probability and statistics, right? If you're looking at, again, water systems and let's say sustainable water management, a normal course would teach you how to manage water systems or do sewage treatment from a very environmental science perspective. But how do people engage with those water systems? How does human behavior shape what kind of water you get? No one studied that side of it. So again, interdisciplinarity. So that's really what we need in India, a lot more of the kinds of projects and studies that can actually help people understand how these two go hand in hand together.
A final question, Asha. So, if you were to prioritize one or two interventions that would make cities like Bangalore more resilient to climate change, what would they be?
Heat and water. Very simple, because in the climate crisis that is on us, these are the areas that are going to be really looming. We're talking about carbon, 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 and of course we must mitigate carbon globally. But realistically, the challenges that are going to affect us locally is too much water or too little water and too much heat. And those are the two things we absolutely have to fix, because our cities are going to be, I don't think we realize the scale of the crisis. In 5 to 6 years, our cities are going to be unlivable because we're going to be facing 45, 50 degrees temperatures. And we're going to be running out of water to drink.
Right.
And so water and heat, those are our absolute things. And the good thing with both water and heat is if we invest today, we'll see the benefits in a couple of years. It's not even that long term, you can actually see that effect, because if you plant the right species of trees, you'll get some shade in 2 years.
Correct.
And definitely with water, if you actually make areas for groundwater recharge, you can see the benefit in 2 years. So that's no brainer. That's what we have to be tackling.
Thank you so much for your time, Harini.
It was a pleasure to talk to you, Vishada.